Nikolai, Frederik, Severin, Grundtvig. I promise you, ladies and gentlemen, that firstly, this presentation will be in English, not in Danish, and secondly, I will not keep referring to him as Grundtvig, since nobody can pronounce it and nobody knows who I'm talking about. Nikolai Frederik Severin Grundtvig was, as some of you may know, what we refer to as the founding father of the modern Denmark. Who was that guy? Whose influence we can hardly exaggerate. For some strange reason, he had to react. It could be interesting to have a look at why. What was it he was reacting to? To answer this question, I think it's a little more interesting to focus on when he was, rather than who he was. He was an enormously influential man. He was a pastor. He was a Protestant. But he also saw some things in what was then, as it is now, the National Church of Denmark that he did not like. And that is one of the major reasons that he reacted in the first place. What happened around the time when he came about? These are interesting times, I can assure you of that. You can look up any dictionary and you will have very long lists of what goes on. And this is when it happens. In 1782, we have a lot of things going on. I haven't put this on the slide, but in 1776 we have the American Revolution, followed by a very, very long period of wars with the British to secure independence. In 1782, a lot of things starts happening based on this. He's not here yet in 1782. Why is 82 important? That's because a lot of other things happen in 82. We see, or we begin to see, the consequences of industrial revolution in the British Isles, which has a tendency to crawl to Europe. Things start happening here as well, not the least in France. We have the Montgolfier brothers, who fly the prototype of the first hot air balloon in 1782. We have Signore Paganini, who was a very famous Italian violin virtuoso. We have the death of another very famous person from music. We have Signore Farinelli, who was an Italian castrate singer of the 1760s. We have a lot of things going on. The years and the ages of extraordinary science saw the dawn of light. The British fought the French again, and they won, which was yet another milestone to secure British economy in Europe. It was the Battle of the Lost Saints. I have a picture on the slides to the right, just beneath Paganini. And this is yet another one of these battles that secures British dominance and French defeat, which is another one of the reasons for the later French Revolution. But we come back to that. In 1783, this is when Grundtvig was born. Many more things happened. The British finally had to acknowledge that the Americans have won the War of Independence and are to be looked upon as an independent country. And Montgolfier and his brother takes off with passengers, November 21st, from Bois de Boulogne in Paris. Not long after, we see the first hydrogen balloon on December 1st, also carrying passengers. So, inventions, technology moves rapidly. Another little sign of things to come, in this year, Simón Bolívar, who's known as the liberator of South America, was born. Doesn't take long, another 20-25 years, and Spain has lost most of its colonies in South America. But alas, what is good for Europe is not always good for anybody. In Denmark, we saw problems. We have thrived rather heavily on our so-called neutrality. I call it so-called neutrality because we used this neutrality not to hide ourselves away from war, but to play on both horses. Which means that we transported goods for the French and for the British, and for the Dutch, and for the Spanish, and whoever was in a situation of war. And this hit back on us when these wars stopped. These wars stopped around the mid-80s, and nothing happened. They could take care of business themselves and had no longer any use for the Danish commercial fleet. So we were thrown into a huge crisis in Denmark. And Grundtvig was born straight into that trouble. We said goodbye to Rococo in 1783 and around these periods of time, and hello to neoclassicism and the golden age of romanticism. We had a lot of turmoil going on in Europe around these days. In 1789, we had the French Revolution, and this effectively ended a long line of autocratic monarchies, and it sent shivers throughout Europe, since all were constituted around sovereign monarchs. In 1800, the English can no longer indulge Danish so-called neutrality, and they send an ultimatum to Denmark. Doesn't really help. We are stuck in our political position, squeezed behind the great powers of the European mainland and Russia. So we still have to say we're neutral, we can't take side. Which was a bad idea because the British shortly after launched an attack. The so-called Battle of Copenhagen in 1801. This battle, a naval battle, ended with British victory, or, if you ask anyone over here, a graceful truce. It only ended with British victory due to an indirect foul play in the shape of a stratagem where Lord Nelson refused to see the flag of surrender hoisted on the flagship. He put his binoculars to the blind eye, we say. In 1807, further attempts to secure an alliance with Denmark, and following Napoleon's naval defeat in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the British, again, sent us an ultimatum and said, now we can't have your fleet lying about here. We need to secure that this fleet is not handed over to Napoleon. We've got to do something about that. We didn't react accordingly. We did send troops to the border, and we did have a very hefty diplomatic correspondence with the English about how to secure our fleet and our neutrality. However, the British saw the risk as too big, since we at those times had the 5th largest fleet in the world. So it was quite a hefty naval power, just lying there, in their view, for the taking. So, in 1807, the British launched the so-called bombardment on Copenhagen, followed by the seizure of the Danish fleet. This was a disaster, not only for Denmark, but very much so for Norway, because we had a traffic going on with Norway, where they sent timber to us, we sent timber to them, and we had to use the ocean. We used ships. And when they took away our ships, we had one frigate in a Norwegian harbour, and we had a few commercial vessels left in Copenhagen. So we couldn't supply them with enough food to secure their existence. And that led directly to the 1813 Danish bankruptcy. We simply ran out of money, since we didn't have much income, and we didn't have the vessels to secure our income. The British took it. So, in 1814, when Napoleon was finally defeated, actually in 1815 that he was finally defeated, but in 1814 everybody knew that that was it. So peace negotiations and peace talks started in Vienna, resulting in the collective punishment of Denmark by forcing upon us and upon the Norwegians the split of Denmark and Norway, which to us was a disaster. We had been in one kingdom with Norway since 1387, formally through the marriage of Margaret I and Prince Olav, and more formally with Denmark, Norway and Sweden in the Kalmar Union of 1397. So we had roughly 440 years of ongoing unity with Norway. So it was like losing a part of Denmark. It was It made a huge impact on society, on the Danish national feeling of self, and this is the important bit, it made a huge impact on Grundtvig. He was then 31 years old, and was just about to throw him into yet another psychological crisis. In 1815, everything stabilized because Napoleon finally surrendered, and a new world order was established, with British dominance and hegemony, and French defeat. On this slide, it becomes apparent what also happens in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. What happens here is the consequences of an ongoing industrial revolution, starting in the 1640s, 1660s in England, and in Scotland for that matter, but on the British Isles, resulting, or as a direct result, of many things, but mainly raw material. Secondly, a culture that makes development possible. We come back to that in connection with Grundtvig. But as you see on these slides are the direct consequences of an ongoing industrial revolution. We have the appearance of gaslight, or street lighting is the more correct answer here. You can see it on the slide to the left. And it cannot be exaggerated, the importance of light in our streets. You can actually see where you're going, and you don't have to be afraid in the dark. A very normal thing in the 1660s and the 1700s was muggings, violence, because nobody could see anything, so you could actually just go out there with a small lamp, knock somebody on the head, and you were quite safe. You could get away with it. The introduction of light also instituted the introduction of new order. As you can also see, the 1780s also meant the introduction of steam-powered boats. This shows a steamboat from 1784, made in France. Several attempts were made earlier, actually all the way back to the early 1700s. But the thing is that the machines were very heavy and the boats were very small, simply because the engines were not efficient enough to produce power for big ships. But they were coming rapidly, and already in the 1815s we had very large ships with Stephenson power engine, double action engines. What you also see is the introduction of the metric system. This was incredibly important. It was the early dawn of globalization, since we could all measure the same thing with the same stick and with the same measurements. So if I said to somebody in Sweden, this is 4 meters, they'd understand. If I said, before the introduction of the metric system, this is 4 feet long, I would have to say Danish feet, and they would have to say Swedish feet, and the English would have to say English feet, mainly because they were different, which created huge problems. Timetables, oh dear, timetables were all made up in local time zones. What time is it now in London? Oh, it's 5:55 p.m., but in Manchester it's 5:55 and 20 seconds, etc., etc. So all the time, if you look at train manuals from the period, they are this thick, because you had to include what time is it in Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, etc., etc. So the introduction of standardized time zones also had a huge impact on industrialization. It's a bit tricky to see on these slides, but it's also meant the introduction of early computerized mechanics. So you could actually start to make things very fast and very precisely, because you could do the same thing all over again. Very, very good for mass production. So mechanization plays a huge role. As you can also see, I don't know if you can see it, but it also meant the introduction of the battery. The Italian engineer, Signor Volta, he invented the battery in the year 1800, look and behold. In 1810, we had a very, very efficient offset printing press invented by Mr. Koenig in Germany. In 1814, we had the photography invention. What has photography meant to the world? Oh dear, cannot be exaggerated. 1814 also saw one of Stephenson's early locomotives, and in 1829, we built the first railroad track in the UK with Robert Louis Stevenson's rocket. was the fastest train of its day, very, very fast, and rather similar to the one we imported to Denmark in 1848. We also saw the first rather efficient, or very efficient, sewing machine. And we saw, you won't believe this, but in 1843, the first fax machine. 1843, ladies and gentlemen, that's rather early. Back to Mr. Grundtvig. As we see it, Grundtvig graduates from a classic normal Latin school, the Aarhus Katedralskole, in the year 1800. This school he quite liked, but he later stated that it made him quite a cold squat and a smug fellow. And that didn't correspond very well with what he expected and what he would like it to be. He saw it a lot as the reproduction and the representation of a power layer in Danish society. Those who had something and those who didn't have anything. And this is what was being quite clearly reproduced in this education system. Hence the smugness. After his schooling, in 1803, he's employed as a domestic tutor on the manor of Egeløkke on Langeland. And here, of course, he falls madly and passionately in love with the lady of the house, Mrs. Constance Lett. Here it might be added that he was also hopelessly in love. But the interesting here and the important thing here is that everybody, every poet and everybody with something in society had their own secret or unsecret, passionate love affair with a woman they couldn't have. Hans Christian Andersen had it. Søren Kierkegaard has it. They all had this mysterious figure that they couldn't have. That is because in this time of Romanticism was also quite a time of Renaissance, where you look back to the old knighthood and say, the ideal here is the dreaming of her. So it's the admiration in itself which is important, and not the actual having her. And that's an interesting thing. So he thrived on that, and he went miserable upon that, but that's another story. Those of Grundtvig's main ideas who had the greatest impact on posterity, no doubt, is the very widely defined and very uncompromising demand for and definition of freedom. We must allow to be free. We must be allowed to be different. Further, he actually also developed an idea about a political democracy anchored in popular culture. And he anchored it in the people, therefore not in institutions. At those days, and in these days and ages, it was very normal that you constituted new ideas in institutions, because this is where your line of inquiry was. That's what you can actually research on. He used the people as a base, observations, and we need this anchoring in the people to make it a public line of duty. He hated formalities, he hated rules, and he hated the written word. He saw that as representations, he saw that as power representations, and he didn't see it as mainly data. Equally important is his idea of a tolerant rather than a strict national church. It has to be based on every man's own idea of Christian faith. Also very important and very interesting that you are allowed your own definition of Christ and Christianity rather than the official institutionalized version. And now it gets important because this is where he introduces an idea of public information and education based on the living word rather than the dead letters. This is a translation of his own words. He was referring to a very strong belief that teaching is at its finest when induced as a conversation between he who knows and he who doesn't know yet. And that's the interesting part. You make education via conversation. You sit and talk, And via this conversation, the other party, who knows less than you do, come to know more. And this is a very interesting phenomenon. And it, of course, can be seen as reflected in the Aalborg model. Our good Grundtvig, he develops. He goes further. The thought and education, the living word, and his antipathy of the written word, it wasn't a constant at all in his life. On the contrary. Through a tremendous development in his own life and the Danish public, they too developed accordingly. Up until 1810, he mainly concentrated on poetry, seen from a romantic ideal, an idea of reconciling Norse mythology and Christianity. That, of course, I might add, led to a severe personal crisis in 1810 and 11. He almost lost his mind because he couldn't get these two ends to meet. And that sharpened his strictly Lutheran Christian elements in his thinking at the expense of the mythological and poetic ones. And you can't help thinking, well, how could he else survive in this? Because how do you make these two ends meet? We have Christianity based on the everlasting, forgiving tale of love. And we have Norse mythology based on survival of the very strongest, where fighting is a part of your basis, as a part of your culture and your ideology. So making these two ends meet had been quite a task for him. There's no doubt. When you have a look at Grundtvig's CV, you'll notice that he didn't have as many posts as one might expect. This reflects the very deeply rooted controversy that he actually represented. Controversy which grew stronger. Over the years it grew very strong and it transformed into a very frustrated polemic tone and attitude against all opposition of his time. Quite logically, actually, since everybody ridiculed him, he ridiculed them right back. So the chances of getting these ends to meet, always ended in thrive instead. In the 1820s, it actually dawned on him that we need a new plan for the church organization, and he launched that in a fierce polemic against the academic theologians. Again, he used frustrated anger to get his points through, and that set the basis for a lot of hostility towards him in his later years. While the latter, according to Grundtvig, considered Christianity a faith that was based on the written Bible, instead you had to see the Christian church as a religious community, which was founded by Jesus himself. At least that's how he saw it. That took priority over the New Testament, which was handed down through oral tradition. Again, we have the conversation-based theories that he really took off with that. In the 1830s and on, he developed these ideas by emphasizing the need for freedom of faith. And you try and imagine this, freedom of faith in the 1830s, where we still had a sovereign monarch. Oh dear, that made quite an impact in this society. This freedom covered on one side all pastors' freedom in the laying out and embodiment of the sacrament, and on the other hand, the abolishing of parish bans. So, citizens could freely choose their own church, their own pastor, in their own mind, from their own faith. Interestingly enough, by the way, Grundtvig really didn't care whether you were a Christian, a Muslim, or a Buddhist, or whatever. To him, it was how you represented your values that was interesting. That, to me, is also quite an interesting fact about him. These thoughts on religious freedom preceded his thoughts on political freedom. Grundtvig regarded with rather big suspicion, by the way, the political legacy of the French Revolution, especially the idea of the constitutionally guaranteed civil rights. He was no fan of that at all. Such thoughts were, in his mind, according to him, formalistic, and they were alien to Danish and Nordic history. As in his proudest moments, both in antiquity and in modern times, was characterized by harmony between freedom, absolute monarchs, and the people's spiritual freedom. This understanding of Danish and Nordic history, unlike the foreign, reflected his general intensification of the nationalist positions that were prevalent in his time. So you could say he was riding along with a public sentiment of the day. It was based on these basic ideas that Grundtvig saw Frederik VI's introduction in between 1831 and 1384 of advisory bodies based on society's nobilities as quite a significant progress. He saw that as the saving of the absolute monarchy. At the same time, however, he criticized the publicitation of the public debate, which took place in the wake of the French July Revolution of 1830, which set aside Bourbon kings and brought Louis-Philippe d'Orléans to power as a part of defense of their constitutional rights. And here we have an interesting parallel. Put similarly, in 1849, Grundtvig voted against the constitution. The 6th of June, 1849, he said no to a new constitution for Denmark, not because he was against the institution of freedom in society, quite on the contrary actually, but because the constitution didn't go far enough to protect individual freedom. That's an interesting fact about him. He was quite a liberalist. His ideals of freedom and popular culture in general, and his political activities, with its base in farmers' life, influenced him, however, and gradually he was taken to a more democratic perspective. And in his later years, he was amongst the most prominent defenders of the June Constitution and their broad electoral rules. That is, of course, we need to add, because in 1866, the Danish Parliament tried to restrict them again. And he was very, very much against that. And, ladies and gentlemen, this is roughly what I have to say about Grundtvig today. There will be more. I have some final remarks here. On this little map, you might see that we are all still trying to develop the ideas of Grundtvig, and there has been a very interesting European experiment in 2010. And on the map, you can see how many countries took part in that. Further, in a special lecture, I shall develop and address Grundtvig's influence in today's modern world, not least in Denmark. I shall also analyse the cultural behaviour behind Danish, we might call it embedded identity. How do we see ourselves? And there are some quite heavy paradoxes in that. With this presentation, I wish to start the discussion on the current paradoxes of teaching, by which I am referring to the obvious fact that society and its educational institutions do not seem to have reflected very much on method. It hasn't really interested us when it comes to best practice for learning as well as for teaching. We've done it the same way since I don't know when, and we haven't really developed from there. I do believe we need to address these issues, and I do believe we need to look at analysing it in depth. We could take inspiration from Konstantin Stanislavski, who wasn't at all satisfied with his actors' performances at his theatre in Moscow. Sometimes they worked, were good, sometimes they didn't. And finally, his wife told him, you have to observe. You have to stop analysing and stop deducting, and you have to observe. And when you have observed for a long time, then you can analyse. So he realised that instead of simulations, he needed just to do that, endless observations. And for the following, I think, 8 years, he observed and consequently analysed. And he reached a much better approach to acting. He created a meta approach to character acting, a sort of acting's best practice. And he invented method acting. We still know that today it's still in broad use, especially in the United States. I want us all to cooperate in developing a Stanislavski method of teaching and learning. I want us all to observe and analyse. And I want us to write down everything that works and everything that doesn't, and throw it away. And for this purpose, Grundtvig is inescapably essential. Thank you very much for your attention. My name is Hans Dorsch, and you've been watching a presentation of White Closet Academics. This was made at Aalborg University. Production mobile video, Paul Grønkjær, Christian Kiel, and Peter Oscar Hell. Manuscript, me. And thank you very much for listening.